back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. It's a great time to be alive and reporting about organized labor, or so I would say. At least it's a better time to be reporting about it than it was a few short years ago, as we've seen a resurgence in labor activism and in public support for labor activism. But an old trope has been revived in coverage of mainstream media coverage of the UAW impending strike. And here to talk about that with us now is Sarah Lazare. I always look forward to talking with Sarah. I always look forward to reading her work. She is the editor of, I believe it is Workday magazine, and she is a contributing editor for In These Times. I didn't want to get those two backwards. She tweets at Sarah Lazare, which is Sarah with an H, Lazare, and she has covered not only the UAW strike, but our latest piece is on the very issue I was just discussing. So without any further introduction, Sarah Lazare, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
And tell me, as the subheading to your piece says, mainstream media coverage of the UAW strike implies that the workers' demands stand in conflict with achieving climate goals. And then it says that's BS. We're FCC compliant, but it does say BS. So tell us, what are they saying? What's the narrative that we're being spun?
So September 14th at midnight, the United Auto Workers launched a historic strike against the big three automakers, Stellantis, Ford, and GM. It affects roughly 150,000 workers, and they embrace a very interesting strategy called the stand-up strike strategy, which is sort of an escalating rolling strike. Right now, there are around 13,000 members on strike, and if negotiations drag on and the companies are recalcitrant, that number could grow. Public opinion is very much on the side of the strikers. A Gallup poll released ahead of the strike found that 75% of the U.S. public supports the UAW workers against the companies. So, it's definitely not a leap to imagine that the companies are trying to push back against that public support. And one way they've been doing so is circulating key talking points in the press. And there's one talking point in particular that seems very much designed to peel away support from the striking workers from those sectors of the U.S. who maybe consider themselves liberal or progressive or allied with the Biden administration. And those talking points are coming directly from executives. And the line is that the strike threatens the rollout of UV vehicles, that it threatens profitability and therefore could undermine the energy transition. There's a lot to say about why that line is not only cynical, but also false. And that's what I tried to focus on in my report.
And I want to go deeper into that. But first, I wanted to talk for anybody that might not know. I knew as soon as I used the word impending that I shouldn't have used that word. It's unfolding, maybe, is a better way to use it. Because, of course, as you say, it has begun. It is an innovative strategy, which, among other things, it reduces the burden on individual workers by distributing the kind of the sacrifice of striking. This is my interpretation. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong. While at the same time keeping each of the plants and managers and companies on edge and kind of distributing the pain on their side of it. So they're not, between this strategy and the public support for the striking workers, and at least the rhetorical kindness that has, led the administration, for example, the White House to extend toward these workers. It seems to me they want to use every PR strategy they can. And that's where this fits in. But, before we go into the specifics of this, I wanted to think a little bit with you about how this has been historically a narrative. It's really being used cynically and dishonestly here, as your piece explains. But we've heard for years and years about how the needs of the environment and the needs of workers are in conflict, and there's no way to reconcile them, and therefore workers are just going to have to sacrifice and pay the price if we want a clean environment for our children. That kind of pitch. And sometimes certain unions have been on one side of that debate or the other, but it seems to me that that's been a corporate narrative for a long time. Am I being too cynical, you think?
I think you're absolutely right. The idea that it's the hard hats versus the hippies or the workers against the environment has been played over and over and over. I don't actually believe it's an organic division. I think that idea of conflicting interests is in the interest of corporate executives to promote, because the last thing they want to see is environmental activists and workers coming together and identifying that they have a joint enemy, which is corporate greed. That's not to say that there are never issues that come up within the labor movement. There have been times where sectors of the labor movement have been resistant to certain, environmental policy. So it's not to say that there aren't like real hard issues that come up, but when you exaggerate those divisions or even stoke those divisions or invent them out of whole cloth, that's only going to make it harder for environmental and labor groups to develop the solidarity that I would argue is really vital in this moment. However, I will say that there have been robust efforts to push back against that. The idea of a just transition, that we can transition away from a fossil fuel economy in a way that doesn't leave any workers or frontline people behind, has become really central to a lot of climate organizing today, which is why we've seen so many climate activists come out in solidarity very strongly with the UAW workers. So there are real exciting efforts to build a bridge that is both, build a bridge between climate and labor activists that's both trying very hard to mitigate climate change, but do so in a way that is pro-worker and pro-union.
And that's economically, it seems to me, extremely feasible, because you have, for example, and then I do want to go into the specifics of the UAW issue, but I remember in some of the pipeline debates that were going on, Keystone and others, that I remember in one of them, they were saying, well, you're going to destroy union jobs if you do this. But we were talking about 2,000 union jobs, temporary, that would be created for the construction of this pipeline and would then go away. We now are in an era where the government has allocated significant funding for climate transition. It seems to me it's a lot easier to replace jobs and save the environment. And maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about how might that work in this case. But it seems to me that again, that narrative has, I think, as you say, awakened the environmental movement to making clear that this is about putting working people in their jobs first, which is why they called it a Green New Deal, right? Because a New Deal created jobs. But enough out of me on that. Let's talk about what the big lie is here in terms of batteries, electric vehicles, and unions, and how just, gee whiz, we're not going to be able to, give you your green future if you want us to pay our workers. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so, first of all, it's important to clarify that the UAW strike happening right now is not directly over electric vehicles. So the big three have argued that because their electric vehicle plants are often co-owned with foreign companies, that they are not automatically folded into the national contract that the companies have with UAW. There are people who have, I think, reasonably raised criticisms of that, sort of calling it a reclassification scheme. So the workers can't sort of technically strike over the future of electric vehicles, but it's very much on everyone's minds, and it's very much part of the conversation because UAW has made it really clear that they would like to see electric vehicle workers benefit from the higher standards that are associated with unions, whether it's pay or conditions or safety, and then B, they would like to the Biden administration is handing billions of dollars in subsidies to companies that are producing electric vehicles, and UAW and other unions have argued that it would be great if those places were union. That aside, in the weeks leading up to the strike and then after the strike started, I had noticed that a lot of outlets were promoting this idea that the strike was a threat to the transition to electric vehicles, and that Biden sort of had to make this hard choice between his commitment to workers or commitment to the environment. And that always struck me as really funny because from my perspective, climate activists have been very excited about working with the UAW, especially under the new leadership of Shawn Fain, the relatively new leadership. Shawn Fain was a reform challenger who won the presidency back in March. And he has spoken really openly in terms of a just transition, calling for higher standards in the electric vehicle industry based on this idea that if there's going to be an energy transition, it can't leave workers behind. And I think environmental groups have seen a real opening in that and have been trying to take this moment to show their solidarity in hopes of building trust and building relationships as a platform to sort of move forward on. And so I kept seeing this reporting, and it was in the New York Times several times. It was in Politico. It was in Axios, which, by the way, Axios, one of their corporate sponsors is General Motors. I was just seeing it all over the place. And so the idea was, A, that there's a conflict between the electric vehicle rollout and the demand for higher standards. But if you actually look at where those talking points were coming from, they were coming directly from executives from the auto industry, executives and lobbyists. They were cited in those reports. That's how I know. And then B, there was this idea that auto workers oppose the electric vehicle transition. And the implication being that the UAW opposes the transition. That is just not true. That there are no public statements have they said that. Shawn Fain has openly said we need a green economy. We just want to make sure that those jobs are good jobs. So I kept seeing this narrative and I was like, wait, what's happening here? This feels so divorced from how movement folks are talking about these issues. And then that's why I decided to look a little closer.
And part of the spin that I've heard on this has been that, they oppose it because they being by implication the union, because electric vehicles have fewer moving parts than internal combustion engine vehicles, and therefore there will be fewer jobs. So they're going to try to, prevent progress into the green future as much as they can, and therefore to support them is somehow anti-environment, anti-progress, anti-all of this, and yet, you're right. They never quote any union official saying anything of the kind. And in fact, if you think about it, if that's true that there are going to be fewer jobs going forward, you think it would be easier to pay them good wages for the jobs that remain. So is this just another corporate invention, this narrative of fewer workers means fewer jobs, and so they're going to just lay down on the railroad tracks and prevent this from happening?
There are two things I want to say about that. One, the research on whether the electric vehicle production from beginning to end actually requires less labor, that is mixed. It's not there's been at least one study finding that it doesn't require less labor. But even if it did require less labor, say it required 20% less labor, well, then you could just increase production 20% to make up for the difference. So it's kind of a made up thing. But then the most important thing is that it's not UAW's position under its current leadership that it opposes electric vehicles. So this line feels very false. Like this is an example where a certain spin is being put out there that is just baseless. And which is not to say that there may not be auto workers who agree with that line. Auto workers are just like the rest of the public. They might fall all sorts of places politically, but there are claims being made and implications that the union leadership itself is taking certain positions, and those are not borne out by the facts.
And that also raises, and you just alluded to, I think, a really important contextual point about this strike and about the way everybody should look at it, which is the fact that, I think of that graph that anyone who follows labor economics knows. I call it the Challenger graph because it looks like when the Challenger shuttle, fell apart. For a while after World War II, wages and productivity were increasing together in terms of employer share versus worker share, and then they just diverged around 1968 or so, and the corporations just kept all of the fruits of improved productivity. That has come to mind to me very much in reading your article and in looking at this. And take the example of electric vehicles. If in fact we've got 20%, just that number that you picked, if it is true, why shouldn't they get a 20% increase in salary or work 20% fewer hours a week? That was the assumption in the 1960s when that growth was occurring together. That's why I always mention George Jetson on the Jetsons working 2 hours a at Spacely Sprockets for his middle class income. The idea was always that this would be somehow, workers would benefit from increases in productivity. If electric vehicles are more productive to produce, why don't workers get a share of that? So it's not, it wouldn't be surprising to me that a union wouldn't be against it. A forward-thinking union would be looking to see how this might benefit them. I just had to put that in there because to me, all this discussion has to fit in that backdrop of the assumption that the media and virtually all politicians put into it, which is, well, if there's any pain, the workers are going to have to bear it. And if there's any profit, the corporation gets to keep it.
Yeah, I think what you said, this idea that if there's any pain, the workers have to bear it, is really playing out in this argument. So, so the industry's whole line on this right now is that raising standards would cut into profitability so much that it would make the transition to electric vehicles impossible. Therefore, workers have to just voluntarily take the hit. Meanwhile, profits are extremely high for all of these companies. Just last year, all of the CEOs of the big three collectively together brought home $74 million, in their own bank accounts. So when they talk about sacrifices, it's like, well, you're not talking about yourself. You're not volunteering to go work in an electric vehicle plant that is non-union, pays low wages, is dangerous, will give you rotator cuff injuries. You're not volunteering to send your children to go work in this industry. When you're talking about how sacrifices need to be made to promote electric vehicles, you're talking about other people's sacrifices. You're talking about the sacrifices of the working class. And UAW is pushing back against this and saying, why should we be the ones to sacrifice? We've been told to sacrifice in the past. Around the 2008 financial crisis, the UAW had major losses in their contract as a way to, supposedly save the auto industry, and they still haven't really recovered from that. Why is it always the working class who is told to sacrifice. And the fact that this line is then being used to argue like, oh, they're against climate policy, they're against electric vehicle rollout is just totally unfair. Because if the executives of the big three care so much about the electric vehicle transition, then they should be the first to volunteer to get a cut to their salary.
Well, yeah. And where I go with this, because of my socialist leanings, is look, if you guys can't manage this industry in a way that meets social goals and pays people a living wage, then I guess we'll just have to take it over, because you've just announced your inability to meet the task. And since we need vehicles, we need them to be electric at some point, and we need working people to get a decent wage because that's an ethical value of ours. Guess we can't afford you. I mean, I guess that's where I go with it. And maybe that's too radical for the American people, but my hope is that at least becomes part of the conversation, so that it becomes a matter of not putting workers on the defensive, but putting managers and investors, rentier, capitalists on the defensive, that if your cut is more than the economy can bear, then maybe we can't afford to give you your cut anymore. Does that sound too radical to you?
I don't think so. If companies are saying that the only way we can achieve a transition to electric vehicles is by exploiting workers, then I think the question becomes, are you the best stewards of the energy transition? And plenty of people have raised that question. Biden's environmental policy in the IRA, the thrust of it was really based on giving subsidies to companies and then trusting them to roll out environmental policies. These are the same companies that have been major climate villains. The big three have a trade association that they're involved in has directly lobbied for measures that would slow down the electric vehicle transition. These companies have suppressed research about global warming, going back to the 1960s. These are not friends of the environment. Their track record is not good on climate at all. And in fact, they're major culprits behind why we find ourselves in the situation that we're in. And so a lot of people have been raising this question, maybe it's time to stop looking to private markets to fix the problem. Maybe instead of giving billions of dollars to companies, what we need is massive public investments in the kind of economy-wide transformation that we need to stave off the worst-case climate scenarios. And there's no reason why public investments can't create good union jobs and be pro-worker. Those things are not in conflict. They're actually very much aligned.
They really are. And people forget nowadays when we talk about the auto industry that it's never discussed anymore that the American people, through their government, bailed out the auto industry, bailed out Detroit, and ran, those companies for a while. We could argue about the management of those companies and the transition back to the private sector, but without the direct intervention, public intervention, we'd be in a lot worse shape. So it's not like we haven't, crossed that bridge before. It's just that people running things now don't like to talk about it. It seems to me it's just like the banking industry, the way we bailed out the banking industry, trusted them to help struggling homeowners, and instead they did the opposite. So these neoliberal solutions don't really sit well with me personally, but if they create a conversation, that's great. And speaking of the climate, though, since we're talking about workers in the climate, do you mind a little transition to a piece you did a few weeks ago about striking workers making climate demands? Because I thought that was interesting too, that Pennsylvania workers are fighting for a green overhaul of the rail industry. That was, and these are workers who I think at various times are, among other things, directly exposed to horrendous heat, as a lot of people are. But I found that encouraging. You said 1,400 locomotive builders and clerical workers on strike in Erie, PA. They're making climate justice demands of an employer. I thought that was interesting and a kind of a hopeful sign. Was that your take too?
I did find it a hopeful sign. UE seems to be doing really interesting work around connecting the dots between the climate crisis and the mistreatment of workers. So UE represents Wabtec workers who manufacture locomotives, and UE also represents rail crew drivers, so people who are exposed to the heavy pollution coming out of locomotives that are used on the rails. And a lot of UE members actually live in areas that are near rail yards that are subject to severe pollution. So what UE workers, Wabtec workers in Pennsylvania have been doing for a while is they have a green locomotives campaign. The goal is to press for stronger regulations of rail locomotives to bring them up to higher standards that would, release less carbon into the atmosphere and also reduce pollution that's dangerous to human health. And they also want their own employer to play a bigger role in pushing those conversations. So that emerged in sort of the way workers were talking about the strike. That was very much present in sort of conversations around the strike. So I took a look at that and took a look at the leadership role. And, this is such a clear example of how the rights of workers and the need to curb climate change are not separate things, because many workers are on the front lines of climate change. And it's the poor and working classes that have fewer resources for dealing with it. The big three executives, the executives of Wabtec, they have ample resources for dealing with the fallout. The poor and working classes are on the front lines. They're in communities subject to greater levels of pollution, and they also just don't have the resources that the wealthy have. And so UE has done a really interesting job sort of marrying those two issues and framing the need for climate and environmental protections in a way that is very much speaking to workers.
And of course, that's an education process too, right? Because a lot of people, especially people affected by environmental conditions, the media hasn't done much to inform them that their child's asthma might be environmental, their own health might be environmental, live in communities more subject to extreme weather and damage to their homes, damage to their community. They may or may not make the connection. They may not. Certainly, this is where I think work like yours is so important in kind of letting people know that this is not two struggles in conflict, environment versus the working class. It's a single struggle. At least that's the way I view it. I assume you do, but I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, I think that the coverage of the UAW strike shows that there's an active campaign to convince workers otherwise, but that we should be very wary and push back against that campaign. I mean, it is very clear that there has been a PR push among the big three automakers to make it look like it's workers against the environment, and that those who care about the environment need to oppose workers. And so that's what we're up against. These divides are fed and encouraged by those individuals who have an economic interest in the environmental and labor movements not uniting.
Right, absolutely. And before you go, just to close off on the issue of the UAW, I have been very happy. I mean, I haven't been looking at it in the depth that you have, but from what I've seen, read, heard of Sean Fain, the new head of the UAW, I'm pretty happy with him. I mean, he strikes me as the kind of person who's a really effective communicator, very direct, very blunt. He's taking a strong strategy. I saw a tweet he did yesterday that was a clip, a gif of Samuel L. Jackson from one of his movies, tapping his watch and going, "TikTok, MFer," you know. I kind of like his style and I like his strategy, but am I just naively looking for like strong figures, or is he really doing a good job so far, you think?
I mean, I have definitely felt hopeful about the change in leadership at the UAW. It doesn't mean things are going to be easy, and it doesn't mean we have a crystal ball into the future, but why not let yourself feel a little hope? Because I am so concerned about climate, I've felt very focused on some of the bridges that seem to be getting built right now between UAW and climate organizations. And I do have a lot of curiosity and interest in sort of the way the leadership under Shawn Fain is rolling out the stand-up strike. It's an interesting throwback to the, 1936, 1937 sit-down strikes. And, another thing is among the demands that UAW is putting out there are, an end to tiers and wages and benefits based on when you were hired, and also ending the abuse of temporary workers. So this idea that you shouldn't harm or disadvantage one set of workers in order to help another. I think that idea is really powerful. And so it's been exciting to see that messaging play out. And then also, his call for a 32-hour work week. I mean, not only would it be a tremendous gain for workers, but it would also be great climate policy.
It would. Right.
And he's calling for a 32-hour work week with no reduction in pay. So you get paid for 40 hours, but you work 32. I don't know if we're going to see that play out in this particular contract fight, but putting that out there, I can tell you I've talked with workers at a practice picket at the Chicago assembly plant of Ford's. And I talked to one woman in particular who was very excited about the idea of a 32-hour work week. That would absolutely transform her life for the better.
Yeah, especially for so many people with childcare being so expensive. I love this beat of the Labor Environmental Alliance. Anything else we should be watching for before I let you go in that field? We talked about the workers in Erie as well as the UAW and what's going on there. Any other fronts in that struggle shaping up that we should be watching?
I just wanted to shout out the Labor Network for Sustainability. It seems that they've played a big role in mobilizing the support of climate activists for the UAW strikers. And they're doing a lot of work pushing back against some of the narratives that we've been discussing. So I would just encourage people to check them out and to look at some of the materials that they put out.
And that, of course, builds solidarity, and solidarity makes change. So, Sarah Lazare, the piece that we were primarily talking about is entitled "The Big Three Want You to Think Striking Workers and the Climate Are at Odds. They Are Not." It is in these times, and Sarah Lazare is the editor of Workday magazine and a contributing editor for In These Times. Sarah, as always, thanks for the great reporting, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.